Hello and welcome to the latest of our Scotland's Future series. Discussions, our contribution to productive and respectful debate and discussion. And today I'm joined by Mike Gettenby, who's the university's Deputy Legal Officer, and Mike works on legal issues across the university, hopefully keeping us all out of trouble if he can. But today we're going to talk about how laws are made and legislation. And we're going to come to that in just a minute. But the first thing I'm going to do is this podcast series was actually Mike's idea. So, Mike, why have a podcast?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me along, Stephen. Why have a podcast? I'm a podcast geek. I just am. I grew up in a house with Radio 4 on all the time, so I now have podcasts on all the time. And this is something we talked about a little bit before over Christmas, but whenever the SFS programme came up, I thought this was a great opportunity to use something like a podcast to get the message out to the wider world of what we're doing at St Andrews, and that's both the community in St Andrews and the wider university community, alumni, etc., draw in the deep well of knowledge and understanding that we have, and also it's just as a way to allow people who maybe are starting out their academic careers get some background in doing media type work. I think these things are all very good, and being able to do it with some of the great colleagues that we've got at the university, I thought would be a nice introduction for them. So thank you very much, and I'm delighted that the podcast was given the go ahead by the committee.
No, it's been really good. We've had some really good contributions. It's good to hear people to develop in our discussions, and it's good to hear that you grew up listening to Radio 4, and now families across the UK will grow up listening to Scotland's Future series podcasts.
That is certainly the hope.
That's certainly the hope. So, Mike, respectful discussion and debate is a hallmark of university. You'll know that.
Absolutely.
Working in the university service, we've got a lot of really interesting people worth listening to, but fundamentally when we have productive and respectful debate and discussion, we want to make things better, the world around us better, and sometimes that means making policy better or, making laws better.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, if people are listening, how on earth are laws made? How do you influence that process? But tell us a little bit about what happens in that process.
And it's a good question, because I don't think a lot of people, for various reasons, understand entirely where law comes from. That sounds strange, because we see the debates in Parliament and we see the headlines, and an issue will be a headline for a day or two, a law will be passed, and then it moves on. And I think a lot of people understand the general approach, whether it's Westminster or Holyrood, that a bill is introduced, it's debated, it is amended, there are votes on it, it then becomes law. What I think a lot of people don't fully understand is that that's the case for primary legislation, and primary legislation is obviously very important.
Can you tell us what primary legislation is, please?
Sure. Primary legislation for a particular subject will give the legislative framework for that area. So road traffic law is a good example. Okay. And I appreciate that sounds very boring, something we've been doing a bit of at the university, but it's a good example. So you have various road traffic acts, and they will give the power for ministers to then go on and make law. So something like vehicle licensing. Again, it sounds very boring, but primary legislation actually doesn't contain a lot of the detail that you actually need in law. What you have instead is secondary legislation, and that is the much more detailed and actually quite often where the more interesting parts of law is.
And what's the difference between primary and secondary legislation then?
Primary legislation will be passed by Parliament, whether that's at Holyrood or passed at Westminster. Yeah. That will have gone through various stages. At Holyrood, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. In Westminster, it will have gone through readings both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There'll be committee stages. And that is where you get a nice Act of Parliament. And there are maybe 20 to 40 of them passed each year at Westminster, so not a huge number. Secondary legislation is then legislation that hangs off that primary legislation. Quite often primary legislation is referred to as the parent legislation. And that's where the real detail is, Stephen. And that's where I think a lot of people don't fully understand that the actual day-to-day operation of the law happens through secondary legislation, and why it's so important. Something like the road traffic laws that I mentioned, the detail in vehicle licensing, that sort of stuff, all through secondary legislation, and that is completely fine. That is completely normal. Primary legislation, Parliament has not got time to go through everything that's in law. It just doesn't. However, what there is real concern about at the minute is the way that secondary legislation is being used. Yeah. And that's been a debate. Now, that's been a debate over the last 100 years. Yeah. There was debates and beyond. Yeah. But there has been a growing feeling more and more that primary legislation is being used as a way simply to give ministers power. And what that does, which I don't think is a good thing and a lot of people have real issue with, it transfers away power from Parliament to the executive, whether that's at Holyrood, whether that's in Westminster.
Okay. So tell me something. You've been, as I'm sure everybody does, you've been spending your spare time reading up on House of Lords reports.
I certainly have been.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about now? What's interesting? I should stress for anybody who's listening. I used to sit in a committee, albeit a committee in the House of Commons. What's really interesting about committees who produce these reports is they are cross-party. You take evidence from experts. They don't make law. They're not part of the in Westminster. They're not part of the legislative process. But what they do is it allows you to interrogate particular issues on a cross-party basis. So tell us a little bit about what your nighttime reading's been recently.
Well, my nighttime reading, Stephen, has been a couple of things, and it's probably worth setting why that's been my nighttime reading. The last 6 or 7 years have been fairly tumultuous. Public law and lawmaking itself, not what the law becomes, but lawmaking, public law, parliamentary procedure should be boring. It just should be. The last 7 years have been anything but that. I could well imagine you have lived through the Gina Miller days. We have lived through prorogation. We have lived through the Brexit debates, which now seem a world away, and then we lived through the pandemic legislation.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I do remember I was a pursuer or an applicant to court, which I've never been before.
That's
quite prorogation of Parliament. Yeah,
I find that quite exciting.
Right, okay,
and
yeah.
actually, it shows you where Scotland's particular role is, because the prorogation cases were started in Scotland, not in England, because of Scotland approach to public law. But it's only now people are managing to take a breath on this stuff, Stephen, because we are through the initial Brexit legislation. We are through the legislation around pandemics. And going back to what you said about the House of Lords and the evening reading, there was a great report that the House of Lords produced in November 2021 called Democracy Denied, the urgent need to rebalance the power between Parliament and the Executive, which I think as a title is great. It's
Democracy Denied, House of Lords report. Go and Google it.
Google it, read it. It's one of the best 74 or so pages you'll ever read. And why it's so important is it talks about the need to rebalance the relationship between the Executive, the government, and Parliament, and the need for Parliament to take back control. And it talks about 4 particular uses of secondary legislation, which it has real concerns with. It's probably
so the Executive, just to take a step back,
Sure.
The Executive being the government, the ministers, the legislature, which obviously oversees.
No, it's government and ministers as compared to the legislature being Parliament.
Yes,
so
okay. MPs,
MPs,
stuff you see, green benches, stuff you see
absolutely.
in the
telly. And this House of Lords report set out 4 particular types of secondary legislation that are concerned. What they call skeleton legislation. So a skeleton legislation is where an act is passed, which is very high level. Acts should have a fair bit of detail, not all the detail, but more and more acts are being passed at such a high level that it then allows ministers, the government, to fill in the gaps. And that means that you have ministers then deciding what the law is. The next type was what they called this, and this was something that particularly came up during Brexit, the Brexit debates, the Henry VIII powers that was often talked about.
Yes.
You must have heard about them a lot. What Henry VIII powers do is they allow the government, through second legislation, to
Although
rewrite.
it should be clear, the Henry VIII, of course, powers predate the existing parliaments.
They do, but and it's a nice name given to it, because of how it emanated from just by Henry VIII. What the Henry VIII powers do is they allow ministers to basically rewrite the law. Now, there are times that's appropriate. There are times that, during the pandemic, during an emergency, it maybe would have been appropriate. Well, arguably, but I would say if it is appropriate, it's for a very short period of time, and it should be very well signposted to people. There's then what they call legislative subdelegation. So a power is given to a minister to then allow someone else to make the decisions, and that is a very difficult position to be. You have no parliamentary oversight. That's been a growing feature and causes quite a lot of concern. And then lastly, something that's crept in the last few years is the power for ministers to make guidance, but then the guidance becomes mandatory. We saw that particularly around some of the pandemic legislation. And why that's difficult is suddenly you can't go and read a law and know what you have to do. You have to go and read the guidance. And guidance isn't often as clear as the law could be. It can be a bit confusing. Now, secondary legislation in itself is not a problem. It's the way it is being used that I think is causing more and more academics, legal and policy writers' concern, and it is something that I think we, as the general public, should know about, because it's a way for governments to be able to hide law. Yeah. It's a way for governments to be able to bring in things that they might not want to stand up and say, and it's also a way to avoid scrutiny. The big difference when a piece of secondary legislation is brought in, it isn't subject to parliamentary scrutiny in the same way. I don't know if you've ever sat in a debate on secondary legislation. There's not many of them, and they're often very short.
I've sat in delegated legislation committees, and they're very short, and it's usually when there's other parliamentary business going on.
And often they're on an all or nothing, what they call an all or nothing basis. So you either try and strike down the whole underlying act, but you can't strike down a particular piece of delegated legislation. So it really is a way for the government to get around scrutiny from Parliament.
So this is about the accountability of the laws that are made.
Absolutely.
And why? And obviously we should care about them because these are the laws, regulations that govern our lives, and we've seen that dramatically through the pandemic. Can you tell me a wee bit more about what the House of Lords report was saying about this? Just build on that a little bit, please.
It's a classic House of Lords report. I say that as somebody who's read a few of them.
Right, okay.
So you could imagine,
So let's take the presumption that not that many people have read House of Lords reports.
It's great because it uses phrases like considerable disquiet. This leads to concern. Now, if you use the sort of Sir Humphrey yes minister and yes prime minister speak, that is sort of the House of Lords jumping up and down, stamping its feet. And unfortunately, because it's a House of Lords committee report, all they can do is put the report out. The government doesn't have to act on it.
All we can do is express their considerable disquiet.
Absolutely,
yeah,
and there's a number of suggestions that they have made, but they can't enforce those. The suggestions are things like Parliament needs to assert itself, but that could. Will that actually happen in the current Parliament? There's an 80-seat majority. So we saw it during the Brexit debates because
but it was a minority parliament.
So Parliament could assert itself in a way the government didn't like.
So I should explain the current Westminster Parliament. Certainly there's an inbuilt government majority of 80 seats. In the previous Parliament that ran from 2017 to 2019 there was no majority, so the Conservative Party, who were in government but were a minority government, as has been the case in Holyrood, except now where you have that coalition, or not quite a coalition, or that agreement between the Green Party and the SNP. But there was no such case in 2017.
And actually, Holyrood and Westminster are interesting because the two different voting systems are designed to get two different outcomes. At Westminster, the idea is that you will not have a hung parliament, you will have a decisive government with a majority. In Holyrood, the intention is that there will be a degree of cooperation because of the proportional representation
and
system.
The Parliament's built differently as a result.
Parliament is built, even things like this, it's an interesting point, and I wonder how much of a difference that makes. I suspect it does from a cooperation point of view.
Well, I think in Holyrood you're not two swords lengths apart from each other.
No, and you are much more speaking through the speaker or the presiding officer as it is in Holyrood.
You have to do the same in Westminster.
But even just physically, you're not, you are speaking to the Parliament and the nation much more so than the other side, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
House of Lords report also talked about updating guidance for officials. I mean, that's quite a, how would I put this, dry subject, but, officials are the ones who draft bills, who give advice to ministers, who give advice to MPs. Better publication of bills to allow that proper scrutiny. But there's one that, and it came up recently in a House of Lords debate that I was watching, and it comes up from time to time. Mm-hmm. It's that idea you should never give to yourself the powers that you would not want to give to your opposition. And I think, from a parliamentary perspective, that's quite an interesting one. Any government of the day can bring in, bills. If they've got the majority, they will get them passed. But bear in mind that someday, if they're voted out, will they want their successors, particularly if it's from another party, to have the same powers? And I think that's something that is often not borne in mind whenever people are trying to ram through bits of legislation that might be unpopular.
So think about it. Well, look, let me ask something, and especially in this series, we're thinking about having a discussion, having a debate about big issues, and you want that to cut through to policy making. Are we all as citizens entirely without influence in this process?
Absolutely not. There's an interesting debate going on at the minute at Holyrood. We had our emergency powers for COVID regulations, and it was probably appropriate they were brought in, and actually ministers in both Westminster and Holyrood were given fairly wide powers. to bring in lockdown regulations. People probably, I've done a count up, there was about 70 to 80 different pieces of lockdown regulations in Scotland alone. 70 to 80 different pieces.
Just in Scotland?
Just in Scotland.
Wow.
Often changing on a weekly basis.
Yep.
Published on a Friday, enforced on a Monday.
Yep.
That's a huge amount of law. Now, that's maybe appropriate in the short term.
And a lot of work in places like, I should acknowledge, in places like the university, where a lot of colleagues really had to work hard to make sure that
I spent
the university
most
was
Friday
COVID.
nights trying to decipher new bits of law, because
Right.
they would come out on Friday at 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock, and then colleagues elsewhere in estates
Yep.
and elsewhere had to make sure that
For the
guidance
Monday morning at
was
6
implemented by 6 o'clock on Monday morning.
Yep.
So a huge thank you, first of all, to all our colleagues at the university,
absolutely, yes.
including you, Mike, for having doing that. But that's a really good that's a really good.
But we're now having the debate. There's now the debate in Holyrood. Do we set up similar emergency powers for the future?
Mm-hmm.
We may do, we may not. What it shows is people have to get involved, because people have, our parliamentarians are our representatives.
Yeah.
And if people want to be able to hand over that power to the government, bear in mind what the outcome, it might be something you don't like. Parliaments should always have the power to be able to vote against and overturn the executive, and as part of the, what we've been talking about here, there's going to be a number of things that will come out of the Scotland's Future series. Some of them will have policy and implications. The best way for us to be able to take them forward, if you have got an interest in it, is engage. It's engaging with your MP. It's engaging with your MSP. It is engaging with the process, if you can. People shouldn't be expected to understand the whole process, because it can be difficult, it can be a bit complicated. But certainly, if there is, it's making sure that you have an awareness, if people are interested in a particular topic, about how the laws around that can be made, how the laws around that can be changed, and then making your voice heard, so that whenever there are these debates, etc., in Parliament, it gives your MP the ammunition to stand up and say, my constituents have contacted me.
So that's a really important point. So MPs are there, and I used to be one, to reflect they make their own decisions, but they're there as well to reflect the views of constituents and engage with them. So I know my experience is MPs are open. You're dealing with so many different subjects in the pandemic, Brexit, from food and drink producers, health services, big issues in terms of foreign affairs. Things are changing. So actually, I'm just going to say this, your MPs rely on that engagement with them in order for them to do their work in a productive way. MPs of all parties are open, have their surgeries, you can write to them. So my experience was I found it really helpful to engage with people, because it helped me out, helped me think through big issues. And we live in an open society. So Mike, we've got a lot of people at this university with a wide range of expertise. Just very finally, what's your message to them?
Engage. Good. Simple as that. Engage. And engage as a group, with colleagues, with friends, but if you need to, engage on your own. Engage
concisely, informatively and productively, but
Absolutely.
do engage. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much.